Welcome to Truth Sentinel, watching over the truth in the news. What's your views on data and surveys? Do you trust the information? We're going to be talking about that today. Let's listen to a quick exchange between David Cameron and Jeremy Corbyn to get an example of data used to manipulate.
Government figures released yesterday show the number of children living in poverty has jumped by 200,000 in a year, to a total now, a disgraceful total, of 3.9 million children in this country living in poverty. Does he not think he should at the very least apologise to them and the parents that have been failed by his government and do something about it so that we do reduce the levels of child poverty in this country?
Well, if he wants to deal with the figures, let me give them to him. Income and inequality has gone down. Average incomes have grown at their fastest rate since 2001. He asks about poverty. There are 300,000 fewer people in relative poverty since 2010. 500,000 fewer people in absolute poverty since 2010.
So there's perhaps an example of the kind of data flinging that people are getting fed up with. But is there a danger that we could actually throw out data and stats altogether and just think it's all worthless? Perhaps there is, and we're going to talk about that too. Later we're going to be joined by Neil Saunders, who was one of Art Bell's last guests and who we've spoken to before. And we're going to be joined by Anthony K from Kazakhstan, Phil from Portugal, and Seth from the USA. I'm here in Thailand, so we've got a real range of diverse locations. Let's say hello to Anthony first. How's things, Anthony?
Scott, I'm melting over here. It's a heat wave. Just sitting in my kitchen wishing that when I turned the air conditioner on, it didn't start spitting water at me because that kind of forced me to turn it off again. So, yes, other than that, really good.
I'm melting too, actually, because I had a power cut and I've had to move to a place with no air conditioning, so we can melt together.
You must be used to it over there. I mean, it's like that all year round where you are.
Yeah, but it takes some time to acclimatise, and I haven't done that yet. Anyway, Phil, what about Portugal?
Hi there, guys. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
It's a bit the opposite to you guys, actually. Usually in the middle of June, it's kind of 35 to 40 degrees here, absolute blue skies and bright hot sun. But it's been raining for the last sort of 7 or 8 months actually, and hasn't really had a break. So I'm in the opposite end of the scale to you guys.
Seth, how's things in Washington State?
Much the same as Phil there. It's been raining quite a bit here. We're supposed to have one of the wettest years we've had for quite a while as we enter a new Maunder minimum, or a little mini ice age, as it were. Not just here, but around the entire planet, which, I mean, kind of goes against the entire, fear-mongering on this, that, or the other with global warming and whatnot.
Indeed. Anyway, let's move on to stats and data and manipulation. Anthony, maybe you could kick off, so to speak.
Sure. I think, though, I'm probably going to be the devil's advocate in this discussion, because I think the bulk of it will be about dodgy ways in which people use statistics. But I want to argue a couple of things. The first is that as much as we should be skeptical of people who are keen to, foist their statistics onto us, we should also be suspicious of people who don't like data and who try to rule it out of public discourse. And I'm going to explain why in a second. But before we get to that, I just want to say there's actually a lot of good news for data skeptics. So we're going to pull apart some data during the episode. But we should bear in mind there are a million pages on the internet with titles like Why You Shouldn't Believe Any of the Data You Read and things like this. And they're just the latest in a very long history of data skepticism. So, if you are skeptical of data, you don't need to feel like the underdog here, because actually you're with the people on this one.
I think, don't you think the key is not to go too far in, and the key with a lot of things is not to go too far in the opposite direction. So, everything is about balance. Like, data and or data. You say data, I say data. Don't you think data and surveys have their uses for sure, but they have their limitations, and we need to learn about the limitations as we learned about the logical fallacies, but not at the same time not go in the opposite direction and say, it's just data and surveys, it means nothing. It doesn't mean nothing but we can't take it as a debate ender. It's it's got to be, you've got to delve into the data and the surveys and find out what was behind it, how many people were involved, who was it funded by, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I agree, and this is the difficult thing, because often that information is not foregrounded. So I mean, I think we should be arguing for better data and clearer sourcing of data. If you're going to use a statistic, it should become de rigueur to say how you came by that statistic. Because then we could have a better kind of debate about it. Yeah. But as I said, look, at least we are at the point where people are skeptical about data, and I think you'll appreciate the irony, Scott, that there are actually quite a lot of statistics showing how people feel about statistics, and these are quite revealing. I'll just give you one example from 2006. The statistics editor for Britain's Financial Times wrote an article called "People's Mistrust of Statistics Remains High," and he quoted several studies, including a National Office of Statistics report, which showed only 17% of people believed official figures are produced without political interference, and only 14% of people believed the government uses official figures honestly. He also said that statistics which report good news, like, say, a decline in hospital waiting lists, which happened that year apparently, those are the least trusted of all. So, there are always going to be people who uncritically accept whatever numbers their favorite politician kind of throws out at random, and it's really irritating when they do that. And so I think we should be trying to push for more responsible use of data for sure. But at least we can relax and know that there are a lot of people on our side here who aren't as gullible as the world may seem. If you watch Fox News and CNN and their graphics, and you feel like, well, they're representing the world and their audiences are representing the world. They're not. Most people are quite skeptical.
Don't you think that you mentioned the politicians, don't you think this is the source of people's skepticism? That quite often on TV, an interviewer will accuse a politician of something that everybody's saying on the street, and the politicians say, well, this is ridiculous, and then he'll reel off some data which seems to go against what people see happening in reality. And nobody trusts politicians, so that's where some of this skepticism about data and hatred of this kind of technique in interviews comes from. Yeah,
absolutely true. The author of the article that I just mentioned wrote exactly that. He said politicians have form, and this is why the skepticism is so high. But we also have to remember that many politicians don't like data, and it may not seem that way. But there are many politicians who try to play down the data as much as possible. And look, there's a really good reason for this. For people in power, data can be a threat because it makes it harder for these people to escape their responsibilities. I want to again give you one very specific example, and then talk more generally about this.
Does it involve any figures and data, Anthony?
It does. Well,
if it
not
does,
exactly.
I'm
no.
not interested.
The example actually comes from, of all places, colonial era Hong Kong. We know that Hong Kong eventually turned around in the 80s and 90s and became, a real kind of economic success story. But before that, it was basically third world. And for much of the 20th century, it was horribly mismanaged by a colonial authority called the Administrative Service, which was staffed by a bunch of expats, most of whom had no knowledge of accounting or any other financial practices, and who literally did not care at all about the fortunes of the local population. And it was a disaster. They ran Hong Kong into a series of crises. People repeatedly lost their savings to crooked banks. Every global economic downturn hit Hong Kong harder than average, and so on. Now, this disaster was noticed back in the UK, but whenever London asked for data on the economic system, they found that it just did not exist and nobody wanted to create it. In the 1950s, the Administrative Service actually announced that data about the performance of the economy and financial institutions shouldn't be collected. Because if it was, the public would have better information on social and economic conditions, and then, I'm quoting this, the authorities might be compelled to introduce new and better programs. So they resisted data collection, even basic stuff like population censuses, because they didn't want people to know how badly they were fulfilling their public responsibilities. And by the way, this also suited the banks really well because it hid their misconduct in Hong Kong. HBSC was there at the time, and they were afraid that if any data was published, it would reveal that they were ripping off the population for billions. And the Bank of England's head office in Hong Kong resisted as well. They were finally compelled to produce financial reports in the 1960s, but they did it without any data. And again, the motivation was the same. If you're doing something nasty and exploitative, the data will out you, so avoid it. Now, personally, I think this is important to bear in mind. When people tell us not to trust statistics, I think they have a point, but I think we also need to ask ourselves, what would a world without data be like? Because one answer is you'd have people like this in power getting away with even more than they get away with now.
Why don't we just, before you continue, Anthony, I know you've got more to say. Why don't we just get an initial reaction from
Sorry.
Seth and then Phil?
Uh-huh.
Okay, well, first, I absolutely agree for the most part there that we need to have a healthy amount of skepticism for statistics in the first place, because they can be put out and twisted by whoever, because there's data or statistics doesn't mean it's necessarily accurate data, or that it's even based on an actual study. Because in this case, I've got one here from Donald Trump that just came out last year. Donald Trump using false statistics to make a race point or to race bait. This is something he tweeted last year on, I believe, in November of last year. This says USA crime statistics. It's got a little graph here with a black guy with a gun with like a bandana over his face, and he's pointing it sideways. And it says USA crime statistics 2015. And the source is the Crime Statistics Bureau of San Francisco, which I will have you know does not exist. And it says blacks killed by whites, 2%. It says blacks killed by police, highlighted in blue, 1%. Whites killed by police, not highlighted, 3%. Whites killed by whites, 16%. Whites killed by blacks, 81%. And blacks killed by blacks, 97%. Granted, none of this is based on anything, as all the statistics on crime statistics come out of the FBI and had not yet come out for the 2015 year, as 2015 was not over. Yeah, so it shows that you can literally just pull stats out of your ass, and if they have no grounding in reality, then it's a moot point. There's nothing to it. It's literally just it's crap that these people can say. But there are great examples of statistics that are worth a damn, because people actually had a modicum of integrity and literally just you went with what the information was. I'd say, as you brought up there, Anthony, what would a world without data or stats look like? And it would probably be one that is essentially abandoned of information, and it is void of information, in which everyone embraces emotional knee-jerk reactions to everything, and whatever the political pundits, whatever your religious leaders, whatever your politicians tell you to believe.
Yeah, and I mean, although it does depend on what you're talking about. Like, if we look at the Orlando shooting, data's not going to help us understand that, or it may play some small role. But there, we need eyewitness accounts, we need detailed investigation, we need that kind of thing. But if we're looking at, why so many shootings happen in the US, we can't focus on just one shooting and look at it in depth. We need to go across a variety of incidents and talk to a variety of people and kind of try and piece together what they say into some kind of picture. And when you do that, you've got data. So it really depends on exactly what it is you're investigating.
I've got to say, like, sometimes I admit, like, I have some knee-jerk reactions to things, and one of them is statistics, partly because I used to have to teach it as an environmental educator, and I hated it. I just hated kind of trying to teach something that I was very bored with. But just listening to you guys talk about it, it makes me realize that it's not actually the statistics that I have a reaction to. It's the use of the statistics, which I think is what all of you are kind of getting at. So the definition I found, this is one definition I found, which was statistics is the study of the collection, analysis, interpretation, presentation, and organization of data. And I don't have a problem with any of that. When I see, like what Seth was saying, people just pull stats out of their asses, and you get these people kind of using numbers to try and back up an argument that often makes no sense to me, and so I end up reacting to that as well, because I try to find some background to the numbers that they're presenting, to the statistics that they say they've thoroughly researched, that they say they've collected, analyzed, interpreted, presented, and organized. But I can't find any of it. I can't find the backing to that. And so politicians, I agree, like they're the worst at using the statisticians. But the statisticians themselves, I think, are quite admirable people, because they have a passion for numbers, and they have a passion for what they're actually researching, and a passion for getting it absolutely accurate. But then people take those numbers and they fiddle them around. It's that saying, cook the books. That's what they do. They cook all of these numbers and make them fit whatever argument suits their kind of purposes. So that's what I kind of have a major problem with. I found some really nice quotes on statistics. A couple of these are from quotegarden.com. The first one is 98% of all statistics are made up. Unfortunately, the author is unknown. I'm not sure I agree with that, but it could be true. One of my favorite ones is statistics are like bikinis. What they reveal is suggestive, but what they conceal is vital. And this is by a guy called Aaron Levinstein, and I really liked what he says there, because that kind of backs up what I was saying. That was sort of a perfect quote for misuse of the numbers that statisticians have gone to so much trouble to collect.
I was going to make a confession to myself, actually. I used a famous study by Urberger and Umlauts when they did a study of migrant workers in Jaipur, India, in the 70s, to back up a point I was making in an essay at college, and that was actually completely fabricated, but it really did help me get a higher grade.
Well done. You're right though, Phil. I think one of my favourite quotes is by an Australian economist. I'm trying to remember his name, David Clark, I think, and he said, or perhaps quoted someone else saying, economists use data like a drunk uses a lamppost for support rather than illumination. I really like that one. But you're right about statistical bodies. I mean, I've in the last week or so, I've been visiting. This is my life now. I've been visiting websites of statistical offices in various countries, and they're totally into it. But there is a problem, which is that they need funding. You know, statistics doesn't have an obvious product. I was reading, for example, the Swedish statute, which describes the Swedish Office of Statistics and its role, and there wasn't enough in there for my liking about independence from the government of the day. Like, they did say this is an independent body, a government agency, and so you know, like it's not employed by the parliament. They do say that, but there's nowhere near enough focus on that for my liking. And this used to be a problem in particular in Britain. There was reform, I think, somewhere around the end of the last decade, because it had become so obvious that the Office of Statistics was beholden to the government of the day. And that obviously Britain is not alone in that. You know, other countries have that problem too. But I wanted to mention one more thing, and it's about the World Bank. Now, we all know the World Bank is evil, but just to put that to one side for a second, one of their areas of responsibility is collecting and publishing figures about the annual economic development and growth of each country, and they collect those from national governments. There's an interesting academic paper about this called Transparency, Protest and Autocratic Instability, and it compares the amount of data provided to the World Bank by open democratic societies to the amount provided by autocratic regimes. And it turns out that the autocratic regimes hand over much less data. Now, the authors say, or at least theorize, these regimes live constantly under the shadow of public protests. So, you know, if you think, for example, of the mass demonstrations in Russia in 2011, 2012, or the riots in Venezuela, but as they point out, unless those protests can reach a critical mass, they're very easy for autocratic regimes to put down. They often put them down violently. So for participants, the cost of getting involved is quite devastating. Yeah. So the regime's calculation will often be, how can we keep the protest movement at a manageable size where our security forces can break it up and offenders can be easily demonized in the national media and so on. And data plays a role in that. One way they do it is by inflating the data and manipulating the data and trying to say things that are the opposite of the truth using data. Yeah? So, you know, you get this sort of Orwellian kind of effect where people see an endless stream of fantastic figures, telling them that they're doing great, even when they're suffering. and the Chinese in particular seem to be experts at this. They have an endless stream of fantastic figures about the economy, floating out over a still largely poor population, But the other thing that happens is that they can simply not publish the data at all. And so, according to the authors of this report, that's why autocracies release much less statistical information. And again, I think this is a reminder. We need to demand more of the people who use data. We need to demand that they use it more responsibly, and we need to evaluate it more critically. But we should also be suspicious of the lack of data, and we shouldn't be too general in our criticism of the whole idea of data, because actually it does at least do a little bit to, as they say in Australia, keep the bastards honest.
I think we'd all agree. Well, I know, I'm speaking for myself, I agree with you totally. Do you think there's a way that we can tell whether data is true if we're just presented with some figures? How do you think we can know whether it's true or not?
Well, one way is to source them, but I mean, even that is a little bit. I mean, this is where we really do run into problems. Even that is a little bit contentious. You and I have personally run through this exercise a couple of times where we're talking about a particular issue. Some data comes up. We go to the source. We look at the website of whoever produced the data, and one of us will have one opinion on these people, and the other will have a different opinion on these people. Whether they're impartial. Whether they're an impartial data collection agency or whether they're somehow in the pocket of a government or whatever, it can often be very difficult to tell, and that is a genuine problem.
And do you think also that some problems with data and surveys is not necessarily manipulation? It's just like assumptions are being made about data that might be slightly incorrect by accident rather than by design.
That's also true. I mean, there was an interesting example I ran across where so there was a question asked in a survey. I don't remember who this survey was done by, but it was a large polling agency in the US. And the question was, do you believe that President Obama could have done some things better during his presidency? This was after his first term. And do you believe that he could have handled some issues better than he did? And of course, 97% of people said yes, because even if you love the president, there's got to be something that you think he could have done better. Yeah. So, and then this was reported as a disapproval rating for President Obama in the 90s, that 90% and above. And I'm not sure if that was the media putting a spin on it, or if that was just like the original meaning of the question getting lost in the wording as people try to paraphrase things and fit them into column inches and things like this. So the intent of the question was just lost, and what we end up with is something that is not the same as what people meant when they answered the questionnaire.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think this is kind of what partly what I was getting at. It's perhaps my second problem with statistics is the reduction of things to numbers. It's basically reductionism. And you asked the question, Scott, of like, how can we know if statistics is true? Well, part of the answer to that, I think, is gathering all the statistics together. Because when you present just one set of numbers, you're just presenting one side of, one point of view, one side of a much larger picture. And there's so much information out there, so many different sets of numbers and categorizations that it's difficult to sort of get a whole picture, because you'd be asking for so much information all in one go. And that article on, or what you were saying about the questions asked of President Obama, could he have done better, is a perfect example of that, because it's not the question isn't really a reflection of how well he actually did. It's just, and it's not a reflection of him doing a bad job. It's just it's obvious that most people are going to answer, yes, he could have done better, because
and it's a bad question, isn't it? It's a bad question.
Yeah,
I mean,
totally.
even if it was devised with completely good intent and honest intent to find out what people think about stuff, it's just a bad question.
And in economics is the perfect example of what I'm talking about, really, because everything, including human beings, are reduced to mere numbers in economics. So they're reduced to a monetary value. And the value is based on a set of criteria, but those criteria are sorely missing something. They fall so way short of true value. So the true costs, for example, of shipping, say, pineapples from Costa Rica to Europe are far greater than what is reflected in the supermarket price. So you have the social costs of labouring in fields every day to feed a family. You have the health costs along with that, the environmental costs of clearing a forest for plantations, the use of monocrops, the use of pesticides, the pollution costs of chemical use, and all of the transport involved. And then further costs of waste when some of the product aren't sold and thrown into landfill sites. The knock-on effects are almost limitless. So that's kind of one area where, just in the economy, where things are reduced to numbers, things are reduced to stats, and it doesn't reflect the whole picture. But it's starting to, and that's what I think is interesting about statistics. Is, like I said before, statisticians are so passionate about their subject that they want to use numbers to give a holistic picture of the world and life and what is really going on. They don't want their numbers to be used by politicians to meet their own ends and so on. So,
and we've got our own numbers ticking down in the form of a digital clock. Seth, what's your final views on this topic?
To wrap it up pretty quick, just the last of the article I had here from Business Insider, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek of 73.6% of all statistics are made up. This is by an individual who's a technology consultant and is talking about being in Japan and actually doing consulting for a technology firm of phones and whatnot. And it says here, quote, I was in the midst of sizing the mobile handset market in 3 regions, U.S., Europe, and Asia. I had reports from Gartner Group, Yankee Group, IDC, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and a couple others. I had to read each report, synthesize it, and come up with our estimate of our market going forward. In data analysis, you look for primary research, which means the person who initially gathered the data. But all of the data projections were so different, I decided to call some of the research companies and ask how they derived their data. I got the analyst who wrote one of the reports on the phone, and I asked how he got his projection. He must have been about 24. He said literally, I shit you not, quote, well, my report was due and I didn't have much time. My boss told me to look at the growth rate average over the last 3 years and increase it by 2% because mobile penetration is increasing. There you go. As scientific as that. And I'd say that certain reports, granted, when you have an area as a little bit different from business, I figure it changes a bit. But of course, it's all about who's paying you, who's doing the research, I think stats and all that data comes down to the integrity of the individuals doing the studies that are actually putting together the information. And as you guys had already said there, how you phrase your question, what kind of a hypothesis you're coming up with there, and whether or not you were even coming up with trying to fit data into a hypothesis that you came up with, a preconceived idea, or you're just simply going by the data of simply what is. And I figure the better studies out there that are more accurate would have a lot more to do with actually just simply going out and collecting data, regardless of your own preconceptions. And the garbage data or junk studies out there has everything to do with trying to fit things into one's own political preconceptions, where literally one will fabricate data, as we just had with Donald Trump there.
Wow, you just brought up 2 really important areas that we're not going to have time to discuss. One is why there's so much junk science, and the other one is publication bias, where, you know, like if a researcher has a preconceived notion and then the data contradicts it, he thinks like, oh, gee, I must have used the wrong method, and tries another survey, and so doesn't publish the data that contradicted what he already thought. And that's a big problem as well.
Let's leave the final word to you, Anthony, on why we shouldn't throw data out completely.
Well, I think it's one of the many tools we have. We've mentioned, you know, anecdote, personal experience. We've mentioned like looking at the bigger picture and the hidden picture that's often below a very superficial piece of data. But I think it's got to be a tool, because it's got to be in our toolbox, because there are so many things which are better understood with it than without it.
And I think Phil made a good point as well, that don't listen to one piece of data, examine various pieces of data. And I think it's true, don't listen to one person or one point of view, and don't trust one source of news. Try and get a balanced view on everything. But unfortunately, that is all we've got time for today, and just wanted to thank you all for coming in and contributing.
Thank you, Scott. It was wonderful to be here.
Yeah, you're most welcome, Scott, and good to speak with you, Seth, and Anthony, as usual. And I'll leave you with one last quote. This is from Joseph Stalin, of all people. "A single death is a tragedy. A million deaths is a statistic."
Ooh.
We should leave a hushed silence now. Next, we're going to go over to Neil Saunders, who joined us once before, to see what he has to say on this topic. So we spoke to Neil Saunders on episode 56 about media and mind control. Neil has degrees in psychology, film and media studies. He can be seen on shows such as Rich Planet TV with Richard D. Hall. He's done seminars on techniques used in sales and marketing, and stats and data are often used in those fields, so I thought it'd be nice to see what Neil has to say about the subject of stats, surveys, manipulation of data. Welcome back to Truth Sentinel, Neil.
Thank you very much for inviting me back.
How are you, and what have you been doing recently?
Yeah, I'm very well. I've recently done a 2-hour, like a longer version of the sales seminar, a 2-hour live version that was done at New Horizons in St Anne's, and so hopefully that might be hitting YouTube and the like in the not too distant future. And yeah, that's pretty much it basically. Just been sat back and watching.
And how about your book? Your Thoughts Are Not Your Own, Volume 1 and 2. Have they been selling okay?
Yeah, they're doing okay. They're ticking along. I don't think Dan Brown's got any fears.
Not yet, he hasn't.
Well, yeah, we got behind him very, very quickly.
Good. Here's a tough question for you to start with. After the recent Brexit results, I saw someone write that questions need to be asked about whether soundbite media and society caters too easily for reporting statistics on social media that people sort of take very quickly and then use it to make big decisions like the Brexit result, which hasn't gone down well. But is there a solution to this, or do you think it's inevitable that we are in a society that uses this soundbite media?
Well, absolutely. I think soundbites, memes are usually the way that people communicate complicated arguments nowadays. And I think that the trouble with soundbite media is, I think Noam Chomsky probably talked about this far more intelligently, but the point is that you can't condense complicated issues down to 10-second sound bites always. And so the most popularist, the broadest, the most lowest common denominator aspect of that particular issue is often the one that gets sort of brought to the forefront. And a lot of the time as well, basically falsehoods, misinformation, disinformation, misrepresentation, misunderstandings are pushed, and the perception of them is taken by an audience and soon becomes sort of factual and it is sent around very, very quickly. And a lot of this is to do with the advent of rolling media and the need to constantly be updated with the newest facts very, very quickly and not be the last person to get this information. And also I think the advent of social media, basically it's a sort of expansion of that. Everything's got to be now. You've got to find out about this immediately. And so again, the problem with that is that sometimes careful consideration of the facts basically goes by the wayside. Earlier
I was discussing with Anthony, Phil and Seth about the notion that data can be used to prove anything. What would you say about that statement?
It can on the face of it. It depends how much you understand how statistics work and how marketing and advertising works. On the face of it, yes, you can use statistics or you can manipulate numbers to seemingly show whatever outcome that you wanted, and there's a number of ways that you could do that. But it depends who's receiving that information and how they're decoding it. If you were somebody that was very versed in how statistics work, you could go, oh, I see what they've done there, but that's not truly representative of the truth, basically. And let's just start off with why do polls and statistics get thrown around? And my contention is that basically something like a very right-wing paper will put out a very right-wing sentiment. David Cameron, most popular prime minister since Winston Churchill. 75% of people that we've interviewed agree with this sentiment. And so you say, oh, well, that's interesting. You repeat that to your friend and you go, did you know that the sun says blah blah blah? And he repeats it to his friend and goes, did you know that David Cameron is blah blah? And before you know it, 3 or 4 conversations in, that opinion has become absorbed as a fact, or has got a lot more credibility than it's actually due, just by the notion of repetition, basically. So you can feed false information into the populace in order to actually influence them to go along with that particular line of thought. That's even before there's different ways that you could manipulate the data as well.
You can manipulate the data partly by the questions you ask as well. Like I think there was an old stat: 1 in 4 women say they've been sexually abused. But
yeah,
if you look more into the questions that were asked, one person's idea of sexual abuse is a lot milder than what some people might think of sexual abuse as rape.
Well, quite. I mean, there's a number of ways that you could use weasel words or that sort of like different interpretation of terms in order to get a more favourable outcome for your particular organisation. You always need to see who it is that's actually conducting the tests and what they might want to be an outcome. Do you know what I mean? Like, for example, a very aggressive pro-life organisation is not very likely to produce a statistic that shows that abortions are in any way helpful, are they? Do you know what I mean? They're going to perhaps stick to data that supports their cause. You could do this by small test sample. Like, for example, Scott, if interviewed me and you, do we believe the official story of 9/11? No. All right, cool. Well, then 100% of our of listeners or people that we interviewed don't believe the official story of 9/11. I mean, that's not really representative, but it is a statistic, and it's a provable statistic that we can throw about. If you interviewed purely pro-life people on whether they felt that that abortion should be legal, well, of course they're going to say no. And so you could basically say, well, 95% of the people that we interviewed believe that this new law is an outrageous travesty. And again, technically, that's not a lie. It's just that you've skewed the data, and it's a dishonest representation of what you're trying to put out there, basically.
Yeah, or you could do 30 surveys until you came up with one that kind of backed up your argument.
Yeah, I mean, you could just lie, or you could frame your questions. Basically, you walk up to somebody in the street and you go, are you scared of worldwide nuclear war? Are you concerned about the amount of civilian casualties caused by wars? Are you concerned about the illegal natures of wars that this country is fighting? Are you in favour of the approaching war? No, of course you're not. But if you said, are you fearful of tyrants and despots? Are you wary of dictators gaining access to powerful weapons? Do you think that we should use our country's strength to help liberate those under totalitarian regimes? Are you in favour of the approaching regime change? Boom. Of course you are. You'd be a fool not to. Or you could basically embarrass people into doing something, which, by saying, you're not one of those idiots that thinks this, are you? You're not one of those cowards that thinks, oh, come on, oh, wise up. You might be influenced. You can use that by words, The most famous case of that was the concept of calling people who were opposed to America's involvement in, I forget whether the Second or the First World War now, actually. The Second World War, sorry. Calling them isolationists, which was essentially just, a way of calling people cowards and making them feel one of the minority, feeling inferior, which is how polls and statistics work, to sort of show you either that a person in authority, a third-party advocate, somebody who's very, very clever and has been put into a position of authority because they know their stuff, is telling you to do this, or alternatively that you were right and the group that you're associated with is the largest and therefore basically you're most safe, essentially, for want of a better word.
Also, don't you think there are some people who kind of agree with things anyway? Like, I know Mark Dice goes out sometimes and does surveys on the street and says ridiculous things like, do you think everyone over the age of 21 should be killed? And you get these people who just sort of say yes. And I wondered if it's more down to the psychology of just wanting to be liked by someone they've just met,
Yeah, a lot of the time. Yes, it is. And these ways I think he actually uses a lot, sort of like by saying yes over and over again, you can elicit a positive answer to sort of like further questions along the line. It's actually a sales technique.
Isn't it also used in hypnotherapy?
I would not actually, it may well be. Not in the stuff that I use, but it may well be. But the point is that basically it's kind of putting your mind on one track until, so the momentum almost sort of like gets you going along with it. But yeah, people can be convinced to go along with things quite easily. Have you ever heard about the Solomon Asch experiments, where essentially they draw 3 lines and one of them was clearly longer than the other 2, and basically the survey would go around, so describe these 3 lines, and somebody would say, well, they're all exactly the same length. Yeah, no, that's really accurate. And it'd go around, everybody in the whole class would say they're all exactly the same length. One of the class, who was the test subject, would be there going, well, this is very strange, perhaps I'm seeing this wrong. And apparently in 75% or more of cases, the single test subject went along with the crowd rather than suffer the sort of social embarrassment, I assume, of actually pointing out that everybody else was wrong, because it's disconcerting to go against the entire environment. Basically, there was other experiments where basically they lit fires, and because nobody reacted to it, the person sort of didn't react to it really either. I think, saying it out loud, it sounds almost like a sort of Jeremy Beadle sketch, but yeah, apparently it works. So you can influence people to do these things, basically.
Yeah, peer pressure can be quite a powerful thing. But we've talked about some of the negative side. So there are limitations to data and surveys, but is there a danger that people could become too skeptical about data, so that data that is actually correct will be ignored?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I've not heard what Anthony had to say, but I assumed that the crux of his argument is that basically this isn't good statistics. These statistics that are presented to you, it's poor data. It's easily taken to pieces if you've got the time or the inclination to actually do it. And when you're presented with sound data, sound statistics, and you've got the double-blind test or whatever, or the basic backing and the fundamental approach to it that proves that, yeah, my experiment is sound, my data is not corrupt, and therefore my statistics are accurate. Of course, that's how you test things and judge whether you're accurate in your previous thoughts and such like that, with statistics and such like that. So of course there's not always bad data. And I think it ties into your point as well, because of this sort of like catch bite, sound bite, blah, 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 24-hour rolling news environment that we live in, that gets passed by the wayside for the most sensational or often the most useful to your previous school of thought. Like whatever statistic happens to support your argument will be the one that you feel is the most, or often that people will feel is the most pressing and the most the one that needs to be shared the most, basically.
And do you think also, though, part of the problem is that there's a kind of belief, and maybe it's true, that statistics and data are a bit boring, and people kind of, if someone gives someone a hard, cold fact, they kind of roll their eyes and they're just like don't want to hear them because it's a bit boring as well. People want to hear emotive language and well-reasoned arguments over a period of time, rather than just to be hit with a stat,
Well, I mean, I don't know that people always want to hear well-reasoned arguments, to be quite honest. Like,
or something emotive,
Yeah, I think that's accurate. That people want to either be excited or have certain feelings or circumstances justified in some way, or as you say, just like to get involved in an idea, basically. I mean, that's what a lot of things boil down to on a sort of on a brass tacks sort of basis, is the inclusion to a group, say political affiliation, for example, a very, very hardcore political affiliation. What does that offer you as an individual? It offers you inclusion to a group, friends, safety, the security that you're not on your own, the security that you're surrounded by like-minded people. And it also affords you an ideology that basically explains the world to you and explains exactly whose fault everything is and exactly what you should be doing and where you fit into that world. And so that's an incredibly, very, very attractive psychological state that people find themselves drawn to, basically. And so I think that is often manipulated by people as well, because again, it's easy. And one of the strangest things as well is that basically people are easier to control when they're in a group or when they identify with a group, because the rules of being associated with a group are that you have to go along with the rules of the group. You can't join the country club unless you wear a shirt and tie or whatever. And so, in some senses, basically, people get swept up.
Do you know of any covert government programs that advocate the deliberate misuse of data as a propaganda tool, or do you think that there are departments that are deliberately working on data manipulation in government?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's been numerous times that there's propaganda departments. They manipulate news data and news media to more accurately represent, the wants and needs, or basically to direct belief. I mean, they've been caught numerous times during the Iraq conflict, during the Yugoslavia conflict. Embedded journalism, essentially CIA propaganda departments getting involved in taking over. During the Yugoslavia conflict, 1,500 CIA agents worked as journalists for CNN, influencing and news and basically spreading propaganda. And this was admitted to and reported in the Dutch media. So, yes, there are always government departments that spin, for crying out loud. The whole sort of notion of spinning data or manipulating data, non-denial denials, non-apology apologies, use of language, carefully constructed sentences that don't actually say what they appear to say on the face of it. So yes, absolutely, on a number of levels, from sort of personal interaction and sort of party manifesto type things, right up to influencing public opinion on an international scale in a number of ways. And the use of say false statistics or lies is the least of their weaponry, basically. During the Libya conflict, ITV produced an entire segment, an entire investigative program. I think it was either half an hour or an hour long, talking about how Gaddafi had been trading weapons with the IRA in order to help them in a plot to shoot down a military helicopter. And the only evidence that they had to support this was a bit of film. And this film was seen very impressive or whatever. And this television program went out, made its case. It wasn't until after the program went out that somebody pointed out that this was a cut screen section from a computer game. They'd been sold a pig in a poke or whatever. At what level that who sort of instigated that manipulation, whether it was somebody that sold it to ITV thinking, as a joke, thinking, oh, this would be hilarious, I can't believe they've ran with it, or whether it was, manipulation from a sort of government intelligence agency. It certainly seemed to support the government's intentions and foreign policy at the time. So, to me that looks rather suspicious, basically.
Yeah, and we talked about, when we spoke to you before, we talked about how people are really dubious about changing their beliefs on subjects. So a stat's not gonna change their beliefs, because people really do hold them dear. And in fact, I think we're all like that in some ways. I try to be open-minded, but I've probably got strong beliefs. It would take a lot of convincing me that someone like David Cameron is a genuinely good person. But for example,
absolutely,
you could throw a lot of stats at me, and I would, they would just probably just fly past me, really. But
it's human nature, basically. And it's very easy to sort of fall into those traps and such like that. But again, that's sort of why things like statistics and something like a celebrity endorsement or whatever is so successful, because it appeals not necessarily to sort of the rational side of your understanding, more to sort of an immediate emotional response that sort of often it's used to bolster a previously held belief and stuff like that. And not always, people do change their minds or whatever. But you're absolutely right. But I think half of the fact is that is the mechanism. Do you know what I mean? The people in advertising, in marketing, in propaganda houses and the like, and public relations, they understand that people like to do that and can easily be manipulated to do that. So that, in essence, is the point of using statistics, using polls, and using basically broad, ludicrous claims and sloganeering and inclusion to a group and black and white choices and all of that in order to draw people into those prospective groups.
Yeah. I mean, I think it might have backfired with Cameron using people like Obama and heads of banks. to sort of support his campaign with the Brexit, because
Possibly.
I think people don't trust those people anymore. So using them as a kind of to condone a certain point of view wouldn't necessarily work.
No, but I assume that they were probably bright enough to realise that. So, it's a daft person that thinks that your enemies are daft. And I'm just suspicious.
Phil, one of the guys who was in the chat earlier, he said, well, actually he didn't say this, he quoted Stalin, who said a single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. And I think stats can be quite dehumanizing as they grow larger. I mean, we saw with the refugee crisis how the single death of one boy on a beach, perhaps it was because it was an image.
It draws it back to a sort of a more personal thing. You're absolutely right. Once you get into the dullness of statistics or the enormity of statistics, there's no way of connecting that to your everyday life. It's meaningless, to be quite honest. It's like trying to imagine walking 10 million miles. You can't do it. It's just not something that is comparable to you, unless, of course, you enjoy statistics or you're particularly into mathematics or that type of decoding of information. So that's why soundbites work, because nobody's got time to go through the complicated nature of an argument. People want a haymaker straight away, basically. And so, in the same way that the statistics don't work and soundbite politics is seemingly more and more successful, that's why a stark image like that sort of brings it home. It's very much like the girl during the Vietnam conflict running away with napalm burns all over her back and such like that. The concept of however many dead and stuff like that is too enormous for you to cope with, and your brain just shuts down. Like, people don't cope with tragedy terribly well, and they react in all sorts of bizarre ways, because your brain's trying to protect you from these things. But something like that, you can there's sufficient disconnect so that you're safe from it, but at the same time, you can be empathetic to it as well.
And trying to talk about some of the positive sides of stats and data, are there any occasions where you think it's okay to trust psychological studies or data?
Yeah, of course, all the time. It just depends on the legitimacy of the organisation and the legitimacy of the study. You shouldn't be suspicious of statistics per se. You should be suspicious of people's use of statistics. Like, you should also be suspicious of people's use of language. Like, I'll give you an example, right? Okay, the use of spurious rigour or something in a marketing campaign, which is basically using seemingly incredibly accurate numbers. Like, this reduces wrinkles by 17.9%. Well, if they're that accurate, it must be really, really, really scientifically sound. No, they're trying too hard. Like, that's bad statistics. Okay, that's a bad use of statistics. That's somebody who's using statistics and language in a nefarious way to try and trick you. But when people have done incredible scientific or mathematic or economic studies and experiments, and they've backed up their data and looked into the research, and they've compiled it in such a way that you can track it back, and they don't have a bone of contention, and they haven't allowed something to influence them, then of course that statistics is how you present your results.
Are you saying this cream I bought the other day that's going to make me look 20 years younger and not age at all isn't going to work?
Scott, you don't need it anyway, mate. It would superfluous to requirement.
Fantastic. This is why I invited you on. So it's just a quick chat today, but I hope we'll speak to you again in another episode. There's still plenty to talk about. Can you remind us of your website details where people can find out more about what you do?
It's at neilsandersmindcontrol.com, and the books are available on there. It's Your Thoughts Are Not Your Own, and they're also available on Kindle as well, because I know a lot of people have got Kindles, and it's obviously quite a lot cheaper as well. So
I need to get one of those Kindles. I've been just trying to read a book on a little mobile phone just using JPEGs, and it's hurting my eyes. So I'll try and get
fair
one.
enough.
And when I do, I'll try and get a copy of your book as well. Thanks for coming on and talking to us, Neil.
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. I'd be delighted to come back anytime.
So what did you think of what we had to say and what Neil had to say? Let me know. Contact us at scottsentinel9@gmail.com or go to www.truthsentinel.co.uk. That's www.truthsentinel.co.uk. truthsentinel.co.uk. There's a chat room there and a voicemail. We'd love to hear from you, so let us know, and have a good week in the meantime. Take it easy.